In mid-1943, a top German fighter ace named Heinrich Bayer relied on a simple truth that had repeatedly saved his skin. When a pursuing American P-47 Thunderbolt appeared on his tail, he would yank his Focke-Wulf 190's nose skyward, transforming it into a vertical spear and just climb. Every pilot in the Luftwaffe knew this maneuver. The Thunderbolt was a behemoth, a colossal 7-ton machine with a barrel-like fuselage. It performed beautifully at high altitudes and could dive with the force of a plummeting anvil. But it simply could not ascend, not like a German fighter. If you went vertical, the Thunderbolt would falter, its massive engine fighting against its own immense weight, its propeller flailing at the air, unable to find purchase to drag that gigantic frame upward with any meaningful velocity. So the Germans would ascend, and the Americans would stare, powerless, as their targets simply vanished into the blue expanse. Heinrich Bayer had employed this tactic countless times. He was sure of it, as he was of many things in the summer of 1943. That certainty was about to be shattered. The tale of how the P-47 Thunderbolt evolved from a ponderous, climb-deficient fighter into one of the most formidable aircraft of the way. War isn't just a narrative of improved aerodynamics or engine size. It is a chronicle of two engineering teams, one at Republic Aviation and the other at Pratt & Whitney, who flatly rejected a limitation that the entire air war had already accepted as fact. It is a chronicle of a thin tube, a chemical cocktail, and a propeller that fundamentally altered the physics of aerial warfare. To grasp what transpired, one must first comprehend the Thunderbolt's origin and why its own pilots held such a deep ambivalence toward it in the war's initial phase. The Republic P-47 was conceived around a single, non-negotiable mandate. It had to be equipped with a turbo supercharger. This wasn't an add-on. The supercharger was its entire reason for being. American military strategists in the late 1930s foresaw high-altitude combat as the definitive future of air battles. They required a fighter capable of dominating at 30,000 feet, where the atmosphere was so thin, most engines would starve and fail. The turbo supercharger, a device harnessing exhaust gases to compress intake air and force it into the engine at pressures the upper atmosphere couldn't supply, was the solution. However, it was a cumbersome, heavy, and extraordinarily complex solution. To accommodate it, Republic's head designer, Alexander Kartveli, had to engineer an aircraft that was, for a fighter, absolutely massive. The fuselage was huge. The engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was the most powerful air-cooled radial engine then available. The entire contraption resembled a fighter cockpit grafted onto a flying fuel drum. Early aviators nicknamed it the Jug, a shortening of Juggernaut, partly for its rounded silhouette and partly because at low altitudes it maneuvered with the elegance of a thrown brick. At altitude, things changed. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was a masterpiece. Its supercharger screamed to life. The Double Wasp engine delivered immense power, and the P-47 could contend with nearly anything the Luftwaffe sent up. The issue was that dogfights don't occur at prescribed altitudes. German fighters ambushing American bomber streams would frequently initiate attacks from below and climb, or dive to break away, or engage in vertical maneuvers to shed a pursuer. In every one of these situations, at any height below 15,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was seriously handicapped. Its rate of climb was frankly pathetic, about 2,000 feet per minute in the early models, while the Focke-Wulf 190 boasted 3,500 how-ho. Could they possibly compete? That disparity wasn't a minor problem. In a swirling dogfight, it frequently marked the boundary between securing a kill and watching your adversary evaporate overhead as you sat helpless, shooting at nothing but vacant sky. The Germans understood this with brutal clarity. They perfected what pilots termed the zoom and climb. If a Thunderbolt locked onto a German fighter's 6 o'clock, the German pilot wouldn't attempt a level chase. He'd pull back sharply on the control stick, point the nose directly up, and leverage his superior power-to-weight ratio for vertical acceleration. The Thunderbolt, heavier and less nimble, would start to lose momentum. Its speed would decay, its nose would droop. The German would hit the zenith of his climb, roll over, and suddenly be in an ideal attack posture. The pursuer had become the pursued. This happened with such unfailing regularity that German pilots lost their fear of the P-47 in any engagement that wasn't at high altitude in level flight. They had identified its Achilles heel and were exploiting it daily above Western Europe. Back home, this was no secret. Pilot debriefings returned the same grim reports over and over. The climb rate is poor. We can't follow them in a vertical fight. We are missing opportunities we should be taking. The Luftwaffe sees us as predictable. Something had to give. What no one anticipated was that the breakthrough would come not from a new airframe or a different engine, but from a small pipe delivering a liquid mix and a redesigned propeller blade. The engineer at Pratt and Whitney who first tackled the power issue wasn't thinking about combat in the usual sense. He was obsessed with detonation. This was an engine affliction that had plagued high-output aircraft for decades. When you compress a fuel-air mix in a cylinder and spark it, you want a smooth, controlled expansion that drives the piston down with even force. But under intense heat and pressure, the mixture doesn't burn, it explodes. It detonates at multiple points at once, sending violent shock waves through the cylinder. The common term is knock. In a powerful engine at full throttle, knock wasn't just a loss of efficiency, it was a death sentence. It could shatter pistons, fracture cylinder, heads, and cause an engine to seize in midair. To avoid this, engineers had to deliberately limit how hard the engine could work. They had to leave significant power untapped. They set limits on manifold pressure, accepting that the engine could not run at its true peak for long, because sustained maximum effort meant detonation, and detonation meant a destroyed engine over enemy lines. The Pratt and Whitney engineers were keenly aware of the power trapped inside the R-2800. The question was how to free it without blowing the engine to pieces. The solution arrived from an unexpected quarter: water. The idea itself wasn't novel. For years, engineers knew that injecting water into a compressed air charge would cool it. Colder air is denser. Denser air is more resistant to detonation. If you could lower the temperature of the compressed mix before it entered the cylinders, you could increase the manifold pressure without causing knock. You could wring power from the engine that heat limits had previously forbidden. The challenge was implementing this reliably in a combat aircraft under extreme stress without flooding the engine or creating new, equally disastrous failures. Pratt and Whitney Group created what they called their Anti-Detonant Injection system. The fluid they settled on was not pure water. It was a half-and-half mixture of water and methanol. The methanol had two jobs. It stopped the water from freezing at altitude, where outside temperatures could plummet to 60 degrees below zero, and it also acted as a minor secondary fuel, slightly boosting combustion energy. The results were astounding. By feeding this mixture into the supercharger intake, engineers could dramatically lower the charge temperature. That temperature drop translated directly to horsepower. Without water injection, the R-2800 produced around 2,000 horsepower at its military power setting. With the system engaged, it roared to life with 2,800 horsepower. That was an incredible 40% increase, not from a new engine, not from a radical redesign, but from a tube carrying water and alcohol, feeding a system that was already there. It unlocked potential that had been present all along, but too dangerous to access. At Republic Aviation, the engineers grasped the implications for the Thunderbolt's performance instantly. But a new complication arose that they hadn't fully foreseen, and it became the second part of this incredible transformation. So, what was the problem now? All that extra power was completely useless if the propeller couldn't turn it into forward motion. The P-47 had been flying with what engineers and pilots called toothpick propellers. These were blades with a relatively narrow chord, sufficient for the engine's original power output, but now utterly mismatched to what the water injection system could unleash. The core issue was bite. A propeller blade works just like a wing, creating thrust by generating a pressure difference between its front and back surfaces. The wider the blade's chord, the greater the air surface it acts upon per rotation. A narrow blade spinning at the same speed simply can't displace as much air mass. You could give it infinite horsepower, and the slender blade would just spin faster without translating that energy into the forward thrust, and more importantly, the vertical climb performance that combat required. The solution was the Hamilton Standard paddle blade propeller. The name was descriptive. These were broad, wide-chord blades, almost oar-shaped when compared to the thin profiles they were replacing. The diameter was a massive 13 feet and 1 inch. The chord of each individual blade was substantially wider than anything used on the Thunderbolt before. When these blades bit into the air, they took a massive chunk. They grabbed a pillar of atmosphere and threw it backward with a power the older props could never hope to achieve. The impact of the new blades by themselves, even without water injection, was significant and immediate. Test pilots documented an improvement of 400 feet per minute in climb rate just from swapping to the paddle blade setup. This was a major gain in a combat setting. But when the paddle blades were paired with the water injection system running at war emergency power, the performance numbers completely redrew the tactical map. The modified Thunderbolt's climb rate, with both systems active, surged to over 3,000 feet per minute. In certain tests, it went even higher. The 7-ton juggernaut had become a climbing demon. It had a unique sound. Pilots who flew the water-injected Thunderbolt described the moment they engaged it in visceral terms. You'd push the throttle all the way forward and pull a small lever to open the water methanol valve. The engine didn't gradually build power. It exploded to its new peak with a deafening howl. The supercharger's pitch shifted. The exhaust note deepened. The entire aircraft vibrated with a raw, new intensity of mechanical force. And the plane lunged forward and upward with a ferocity that slammed the pilot into his seat, a feeling utterly alien to the pre-modification Thunderbolt. Veteran pilots claimed it was like flying a completely different machine. It was a different machine in every way that counted. The Germans discovered this in the autumn of 1943. The first encounters resulted in a confusion that bordered on total disbelief. A Focke-Wulf 190 pilot would engage a P-47, execute the standard zoom climb that had been foolproof for months, and then hear a sound he had never encountered. The howl of the Thunderbolt's engine, not fading as he climbed away, but holding its pitch, staying right there with him. He would look over his shoulder and see the massive American fighter still there, climbing in lockstep, matching his vertical speed, its paddle blades tearing at the air, its engine generating 2,800 horsepower against the cooled charge. The trick no longer worked. The sky above, which had always been a sanctuary, was no longer a safe haven. There are accounts from German pilots detailing a specific disorienting bewilderment in these initial clashes. They pulled into a vertical climb and waited for the Thunderbolt to stall out below. It never did. Some initially thought they were facing an entirely new type of American fighter. In a very real sense, they were right. The aircraft had the same designation on its tail, but functionally, it was something else entirely. The Italian theater validated what the European one was showing. American P-47 units operating over the Mediterranean were reporting identical outcomes. Enemy fighters trying the vertical escape tactic found the modified Thunderbolt sticking to them like glue. In some dogfights, the water-injected P-47s were actually gaining on them in the vertical, reaching the apex of the climb first and rolling over to attack. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had managed this incredible reversal without the enemy even understanding why. German intelligence at first chalked up the sudden performance boost to a new model of the plane, maybe something with a completely different engine. It took weeks for reliable information to trickle back from pilot reports and technical analysis. By then, the tactical damage was already done. The Luftwaffe's standard counter to the Thunderbolt threat was now useless, and they had no immediate replacement. What made this transformation even more strategically devastating was the matter of scale. The water methanol system was not difficult to produce. It wasn't some exotic technology that required months of specialized manufacturing. Its components were relatively simple. The modification could be applied to new aircraft on the production line and also retrofitted to planes already serving in the field. Republic Aviation and Pratt and Whitney had engineered the system for mass replication, knowing that America's greatest strength was not just technical ingenuity, but its ability to field effective solutions in overwhelming quantities. While Germany's war machine was buckling under Allied bombing, fuel scarcities, and a production system being attacked from all sides, American factories were churning out modified Thunderbolts at a pace the Axis could not hope to match. Within months of the first combat tests, the water injection system and paddle blade propellers became standard on all new P-47s and were being installed on existing planes across every theater of war. The surprise modification that had stunned individual German pilots was now appearing everywhere at once, in numbers that made selective avoidance impossible. The psychological aspect of this change warrants its own focus, because its effects were tangible and could be seen in pilot actions. The Luftwaffe of 1943 was a seasoned force, but it was also one that had developed ingrained tactical responses based on the aircraft matchups from the war's earlier years. Those habits were a form of confidence. They accumulated survival wisdom, passed from veterans to novices through training and combat. When the P-47 suddenly gained its climbing power, it didn't just pose a new tactical challenge, it created a psychological crisis. The one maneuver that was meant to save your life had failed. The plane that was supposed to be slow, heavy, the one you could always escape from by going vertical, was now mirroring your every move. Was there any escape now? Post-war interviews with German pilots reveal a specific anxiety about this period. One pilot remembered the sound of the water-injected engine as something you heard before you ever saw the plane. And by the time you heard it, you knew this fight would be unlike anything you had prepared for. The P-47's structural integrity magnified everything the upgrade accomplished. The Thunderbolt was built to absorb punishment. Its radial engine lacked a vulnerable liquid cooling system. You could fire a cannon round through its engine cylinders and it might lose power, but it would often keep flying. Republic's engineers had constructed a truly tough machine with built-in redundancy because they knew fighters take damage, and the only question is how much they can take before the pilot becomes another casualty statistic. German and Japanese pilots who tangled with early Thunderbolts and concluded the aircraft was slow had based their assessment on its performance at that time. They hadn't factored in what it could become. The water injection upgrade turned the Thunderbolt's ruggedness from a defensive quality into an offensive weapon. The aircraft could now engage, take hits, keep climbing, keep fighting, and still bring its pilot home across the channel onto a damaged engine that would have doomed any other fighter of that era. This blend of toughness and newfound agility was terrifying. It wasn't something the Luftwaffe's training manuals had prepared anyone to handle. A particular engagement from the late winter of 1944 perfectly illustrates this shift. A squadron of P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group met a formation of Focke-Wulf 1 Grenadiers over the Dutch coast while escorting American bombers. The German formation tried their standard vertical break, scattering upward to disengage and regroup. The P-47 Thunderbolts, on war emergency power with their paddle blades chewing through the frigid high-altitude air, went right up with them. The dogfight that ensued wasn't a brief skirmish ending in mutual separation. It was a prolonged battle where the Americans held the vertical advantage for the first time in such encounters. The German formation completely disintegrated. Kills were registered not just by pilots with an initial positional edge, but by pilots who simply outclimbed their opponents. The after-action report stated with a precision suggesting the pilots knew they were witnessing history, that the German tactic of using vertical space to escape had been completely neutralized. What Alexander Kartveli at Republic and the Pratt and Whitney engineers had created was what military analysts call a force multiplier. It was a modification so effective for its cost and complexity that it amplified the combat worth of an existing platform beyond any proportional expectation. The Thunderbolt sent to war in 1942 was a capable but specialized plane with a major tactical flaw. The Thunderbolt flying by late 1943 was a fundamentally different beast. Same pilots, same airfields, same ground crews, same basic airframe, but an aircraft that had evolved from a known quantity the enemy could counter to an unpredictable menace the enemy had to relearn from scratch. The propeller itself deserves a closer look, as its role is often overshadowed by the more dramatic story of water injection, which distorts the full picture. The Hamilton standard paddle blade wasn't just a wider version of the old design. It represented a completely new philosophy for how a propeller should engage with the air it was moving. The older blades, optimized for efficient level flight at cruise speed, were effective only within a narrow performance envelope. Outside that narrow band, especially in the low-speed, high angle of attack environment of a steep climb, they were subpar. The wide chord of the paddle blade gave it vastly different stall characteristics. The blade could bite into the air at a much steeper, effective angle before it lost its grip. This meant that in the vertical climb, as the aircraft slowed and the engine worked its hardest, the paddle blade kept generating useful thrust where the older blade would have started to slip. Add to this the fact that the broader blade surface allowed the propeller to absorb the extra horsepower from water injection without over-revving, and you have a modification that was not merely additive but synergistic. The water gave the engine power it never had. The paddle blade gave the propeller the means to convert that power into the exact type of thrust, vertical climbing thrust, that combat demanded. Neither change alone could have done what both did together. The noise they made became infamous over Europe and the Pacific. Pilots returning from missions tried to describe it to ground crews and intelligence officers who had never been in combat, but understood the gravity of what they were hearing. The double WASP at war emergency power, with water flowing, had a unique acoustic signature. A deeper, more violent exhaust note underneath the high-pitched shriek of the turbo supercharger. It was not subtle. It announced its presence before the aircraft was even a speck in the sky. German radar operators began to link that sound signature to the modified variant before their own pilots had figured out effective counters. Some accounts even suggest that certain German pilots, hearing that specific sound profile approaching from behind, chose to break off engagements they would have otherwise pursued, correctly guessing that an aircraft making that noise was not the one they knew how to defeat. The psychological weight of a reputation forged in the vertical climb was now adding to its actual mechanical superiority. By the arrival of spring 1944, the air war over Western Europe was changing in ways neither side's strategists had foreseen at the conflict's start. The Thunderbolt's metamorphosis was just one part of that change, but its significance lay in what it proved beyond its immediate tactical wins. The Axis powers had based their air strategies on an appraisal of Allied aircraft capabilities that was once accurate, but had failed to remain so. That appraisal was now obsolete, not because entirely new aircraft had appeared, but because Americans, engineers had discovered methods to extract dramatically more performance from platforms the enemy thought they already understood. This wasn't a singular event, it was a pattern, and the pattern exposed something about American industrial and engineering culture that the Axis had consistently misjudged: the drive to iterate, to modify, to test in the field, and to implement changes rapidly across the entire force instead of waiting for a perfect but delayed solution. The Thunderbolt's legacy was defined as much by what it demonstrated as by what it did. It demonstrated that a vulnerability could be engineered out of existence without scrapping the platform itself. It demonstrated that the relationship between a propeller, an engine, and an airframe wasn't fixed at the design stage, but could be renegotiated through focused engineering applied at exactly the right leverage points. And it demonstrated that the American industrial system, at full throttle and guided by intelligence, could execute those renegotiations across an entire fleet in a time frame that gave the opponent no time to develop a response. Like this video. For more stories from the WW2 Echo Spectrum, the P-47 flew until the war's final days in both European and Pacific theaters. It performed low-level ground attack missions that would have been suicide for a less durable aircraft. It soaked up flak that would have shredded lighter fighters and flew home on engines with multiple cylinders shot out. It escorted bombers to targets defended by some of the most skilled and determined anti-aircraft and fighter forces the world had ever seen. And it returned, not always unharmed, not always with every pilot, but with a consistency and reliability that never fell below the threshold of operational dominance. Heinrich Baer survived the war. He was among the most decorated German fighter pilots of the conflict, a man of immense skill and bravery. In interviews after 1945, he talked about that moment in late 1943 when he first met a Thunderbolt that refused to fall behind in a vertical fight. He recounted the experience with a clarity that suggested it was burned into his memory. The moment of looking back and seeing the huge American fighter still there, still climbing, its engine making a sound he'd never heard. He had made the right calculation for the aircraft he believed he was facing. The aircraft he was actually facing had changed. The engineers had changed it. And for pilots who staked their lives on knowing their enemy's machine, there was nothing more deadly than an aircraft that no longer fit the assumptions your tactics were built on. The Thunderbolt had been dismissed as a climber. Then it climbed. And in that simple, brutal reversal, the entire equation shifted. The modification that turned the P-47 from a predictable adversary into an unknown terror was not born from a flash of genius. It was assembled from years of engineering research on engine detonation, from metallurgical studies on propeller aerodynamics, and from the specific combat reports that told the engineers precisely which weakness to target. The outcome was a plane the enemy had stopped fearing in the vertical, and so it became a plane that was most lethal precisely in the vertical. The water and methanol mixture hadn't just added power, it had assaulted the enemy's confidence. And a pilot who has lost faith in the very maneuver he depends on for survival has lost something that no later technical advantage can ever fully give back. That is the true legacy of the engineers who reinvented the Thunderbolt. They didn't just alter a climb rate, they altered what the enemy thought was possible. And in the sky over Western Europe, in the frozen winter air at 30,000 feet, what you believed was everything.